Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. I'm your host, Elif Sarican. Today I'm really pleased to be joined by Amberin Zaman, the chief correspondent at Al-Monitor and one of the most respected journalists covering Turkey, the Kurds, and actually the broader Middle East. Welcome to the show, Amberin.
Thank you so much for having me, Elif.
So just to get straight into it, you've covered particularly the conflict between the Turkish state and the Kurdish people, some of the Kurdish movements, and more or less every attempt to resolve it for over 2 decades, including the last peace process that collapsed in 2015 into some of the worst violence that we've seen in years. In your opinion, how does this peace process compare to the ones you've covered before?
Well, let's start with the positive. It hasn't collapsed yet, and we're actually talking about a law that's soon to be passed by the Turkish parliament as a result of direct talks between the Turkish state and Abdullah Öcalan that are now publicly acknowledged, and in an environment where the government narrative around Öcalan is not one of vilifying him, but rather portraying him as a responsible peacemaker. So that is, a huge thing. We have to acknowledge that, however much
Mm,
the substance, falls short in so many ways of this legislation, at least what we know of it, because it's a very closely guarded secret. And I would say that in that respect, too, this time differs from the previous ones because then we had a much more, freer press and more leaks and much more real public debate about the process. And so I think one of the elements of this is just how very hard-nosed and transactional it is, which in the past wasn't quite like that, where I said you had actual real debate about the process, and it felt much more human in many ways.
mm. I mean, the element of what some people have called opaqueness or closeness has been a matter of discussion for many analysts, journalists, and so on. Some have said that, part of the reasoning behind that is so it's not so tied to public opinion and knowing just how motivated by polls and public opinion in terms of his own power Erdogan can be. But some have said, as you've also said, that actually this is close the space for kind of public democratic debate that may also push the entire nation in the right direction. What do you think is the actual reasoning behind this relative closeness compared to previous processes?
Well, I think one generous interpretation, of course, is that they don't want it to be derailed. But I also think it also gives Erdogan cover and plausible deniability because we saw him in the last round walk away and quite brazenly claim he knew nothing of it, even as his own ministers were sitting in Dolmabahce with members of the then HDP party
Mm,
and shaking hands and signing documents. So I think also the fact that public opinion is, shielded from all the discussions that are ongoing is kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, yes, it shields the process itself from any blowback as a result of, some kind of outcry, but equally, it makes it harder to foresee how exactly the public will react when it's unveiled. And I recall in the previous round, there were so many people who were really quite anti-Kurdish, very sort of militantly nationalist, who were won over, for example, by people like Selahattin Demirtas, who were given a platform to speak and, to reason. And actually, you saw real human beings who were smart and reasonable and talking about peace at a time also, of course, where you no longer had those coffins coming back from the front. I think that was a huge opportunity and one that, I really wish we hadn't lost at the time, but, the what ifs of history. We have to look ahead, and it remains to be seen.
Mm,
And of course, we still don't know for sure how Erdogan feels about things. But of course, all of this, in a sense, not just shields not just the government from potential nationalist blowback, but also the Kurdish actors from blowback from their own constituents. Because I think it's pretty clear that what's being debated, what's being legislated, does not address the Kurds' core demands for political equality in the Turkish state.
mm. I mean, perhaps the most significant difference this time is that the PKK has announced this dissolution, and some guerrillas, burned their weapons in a symbolic ceremony in the summer of 2025. Öcalan's calling for a democratic transition, which is slightly different from some of the demands, that he and his party had. For it, particularly in the last process, and even Bahçeli, the ultra nationalist, heavyweight, pushing it forward in a way that for many was quite unprecedented. From the outside of Turkey or outside of the region as well, what do you think people need to understand about the significance of this process, whether it ends well or whether violence restarts? What is significant about this, and what do people need to understand?
Well, that's an excellent question. And as you say, the PKK, at least symbolically, has, said it won't be fighting Turkey anymore, then that armed campaign is over. But I think at some level there is, a bit of making a virtue of necessity, because on the ground, the PKK was very much on the defensive, and Turkey, with its new technology, its drones, was able to really keep them on the defensive, and all the while just relentlessly attacking them both in Iraqi Kurdistan as well as in Rojava. And we all know that within Turkey itself, the PKK is pretty much as a fighting force no longer operational. So there is that. What it means for the rest of the world, of course, will depend very much on what happens thereafter. But I think you can't divorce this process from what happened in Syria and what's now happening in Iraq, where you see, first of all, uh, tremendous US support for centralization. And this is, the strength of central governments, of capitals, and very much articulated by Tom Barrack, the US ambassador to Turkey, US envoy to Iraq and Syria alike. And of course, this all works very much in Turkey's favor, because this has been Turkey's narrative all along. And now you see Turkey engaging. On the one hand, it of course has its ally, though it's not, all sort of hunky-dory between Erdogan and Shara. We know that,
Mm,
they're both quite bristly characters, but still, they are allies, very much allies, and Turkey is the most influential actor today in Syria, and now forging very close ties with Baghdad. So when
mm,
you look at it sitting from the outside and you're divorcing it from, the whole human rights aspect, minority rights aspect of all of this, and knowing how transactional the relationship between Turkey and the European Union has also become, and knowing how much Trump seems to favor Erdogan, it really looks like the Kurds are in retreat, to be quite blunt about it, and especially given what just happened with the US pulling out of Iraqi Kurdistan.
mm. I mean, I want to speak a bit more about some of those areas, Syria and the US withdrawal, in a second. But one of the elements of this process has been, and many have critiqued, is Ankara has been very slow. Particularly Erdogan and his, I suppose, entourage. At the same time, Ankara hosted the NATO summit in July, a summit that was named as NATO 3.0, perhaps the most significant NATO summit since the Cold War era of, its founding. That's what some have said. And uh, we know that Ankara has been courting, I suppose what could be called a Sunni security bloc from, the Saudi Pakistan defense pact with Qatar and Turkey looking to join. How connected was or has Turkey's slowness on the peace process been to what it wanted from the NATO summit? And is Ankara trying to lead what some have called a Sunni NATO arc?
I'm not going to necessarily connect those two events that closely. I really think that the pace is very much connected to Erdogan and what he needs to stay in power and what guarantees he has coming from the Kurds in helping him stay in power. So there's that. And I think that's very much really front and center of this whole process. The need for him to have driven a wedge between the Kurds and the main opposition, CHP, to
Mm,
bust that alliance. And on the other hand, to sort of also in parallel with demobilizing, disarming, getting the PKK to pretty much cave, having the same thing happen in Syria simultaneously. And I think, it's quite audacious, really, the sort of breadth of this whole thing, where you're not just dealing with the PKK in Iraq and in Turkey, but also with the SDF and that whole process and their own track with Damascus and making sure that everything fits neatly and nicely. And I think that Turkey is kind of, for now, getting its way. But I think the question, and as for Erdogan, going forward, we just heard his top aide say yesterday that snap polls are likely to take place in April, and that Erdogan, he said, is likely to win, which to me is interesting, not because of him predicting that he'd win so much as him predicting that he's running. So this whole debate about, successors and all of that, for now, as long as Erdogan is healthy and, able to function, is moot. So as far as Turkey becoming a Sunni power connecting to Saudi Arabia and all that, yeah, I think that's far more connected to Turkey's efforts to counterbalance UAE and Israel in the region. And where do the Kurds come in? I think the fact that the Israelis have been flirting so heavily with the Kurds, and even as we speak, I know that there are contacts ongoing between the Kurds, various Kurds and Israel. And for, I think, both sides, more than being about them actually caring about their own relationship going forward, it's more about poking Turkey in the eye with it. I think the big sort of elephant in the room for Ankara going forward is really what happens in Iran. That's where Turkey is really not necessarily able to control things, push buttons quite in the same way it's managed in Rojava and in Turkey itself. We know that Erdogan played a significant role in getting Trump to change his mind about, supporting Kurdish rebellion in Rojhelat. But beyond that, we're dealing with a US president who's extremely unpredictable and kind of cornered, and we don't know what cornered people do. We can't predict that so accurately.
Well, before we move on to some of the questions I want to ask about Syria, on the Israel front, um, particularly, I mean, many Israeli, officials have made comments and declarations or, their own versions of warnings about Turkey. And, one of the strongest or the most vocal figures around Turkey has been the Naftali Bennett, who is the possible successor to Netanyahu in the next elections. And he has called Turkey the new Iran or the next Iran, and there seems to be a lot of tension gathering. Some say that it's, almost impossible, a direct confrontation between Israel and Turkey, particularly because they claim that the US would prevent that, and some say that it's inevitable. How real is the risk of a direct Israel-Turkey confrontation?
I place myself in the former camp where I do believe that direct military confrontation between these two countries is unlikely, however nasty the rhetoric gets. And I think that the bigger risk is a sort of kind of accident happening in places like Syria, for example, where these two militaries are, sometimes come within uncomfortable, proximity of one another. And we did see the Israelis bomb a base just as the Turks were supposed to be taking it over, I believe near Palmyra. That happened last year. So, there is obviously some appetite for risk on the part of the Israelis. And there is, I think, genuine concern that a country that's led by someone like Erdogan, who is intrinsically hostile to at least this Israeli government led by Benjamin Netanyahu, and given the horrors unfolding in Gaza, and this is something that's supported by people. It's not just him. Um, there's always the risk of an accident, but to be honest, I think that both sides will always be more inclined to step back from the brink.
Mm,
I think it just, is more useful for them domestically than anything else. Ultimately,
mm,
just, feeding their constituents this stuff to sort of divert from other stuff. I mean, that's a pretty sort of simplistic explanation, I know. And I do, acknowledge that there is real competition, especially Horn of Africa, those regions, and obviously Syria and the Eastern Mediterranean too.
mm, mm. Well, I mean, all of this, as you said, are very interconnected, all the developments in the region, particularly in the last few years. Syria is being remade under Ahmed al-Shara's interim government. The autonomous administration in the northeast is being integrated into what is being called the new state. You were one of the first international journalists to go to Syria after the fall of Assad. What has changed from the early days, more than a year and a half ago under the new authorities to now? And where do you see Syria heading under this interim government?
Well, I mean, we've seen some very dramatic changes. Look at what happened in January when the Syrian army came in and pretty much took back 80% of the territory that was controlled by the SDF, created facts on the ground. I think, and what allowed that to happen was really the fact of the United States throwing its full weight pretty much behind al-Sharaa, along with other Western governments and regional actors, important regional actors like the UAE, Saudi Arabia. And so, yeah, I mean, as I said, I know it may sound slightly sort of, I don't know, depressing, but it's true that at this time in history, things aren't going that well for the Kurds. But you have to look at the broader arc of history. And I would say, as somebody who's covered this region for so long, for decades, that overall things are moving in favor of the Kurds. So this is just a phase where, we've gone from in 2014, when the Iraqi Kurds had, taken over large swathes of territory that were, contested with Baghdad. And in parallel, the Kurds in Syria striking an alliance with the United States that lasted for more than a decade, and Kurds in Turkey talking to the government. Now we have Kurds in Syria talking to the government. We have Mazlum Abdi and Ilham Ahmed sitting in Damascus right now and probably putting the final touches to some kind of new step forward in the agreement that might see the SDF being dissolved. And perhaps I don't know. I'm trying to get the story of Mazlum Abdi and Ilham Ahmed being offered some positions in Damascus. And yesterday, something quite extraordinary happened. We saw Shara tweet in Kurdish, receive Nechevan Barzani, hoist a giant Kurdish flag. Of course, it was quite, you know, opportunistic in some respects because it allows him to say, on the one hand, that yes, I'm engaging with the Kurds, but the quote unquote the right Kurds, like, because we all know that the Barzanis, the KDP, have very close relations with the KNC, the opposition umbrella group in Syria, Kurdish umbrella group. Uh, and so it gives him that kind of cover vis-a-vis the Western governments as well. But beyond that, okay, still it's something, right? It's not quite what we all hoped for. Autonomy enshrined in the constitution along with language rights. But the Kurds aren't going anywhere, and I think Shara understands that. And the Kurds that are loyal to the Abdullah Öcalan-led movement aren't going anywhere. I do think, though, that the events in January has led to quite a bit of disillusionment among many Kurds with the movement. That's a separate issue. But that's not to say that the SDF, if we want to just call them that, have lost all ground. And as far as I know, in Rojava proper, many of its institutions are still functioning. They still have their weapons, they still have their battalions. So, this is being played out. And it's okay, we had violence in January, but it didn't last long. And what I would say about both processes in Turkey and Rojava, Syria alike, is that all of this is mainly being negotiated. It's not, okay, to some extent imposed for sure, because in both cases, I would say the governments have the upper hand, but at least nobody is dying, right? And how important is that? Very, I would say.
Mm. I mean, on the formal dissolution of the SDF and, that being imminent as the next phase of the integration process, you know, some say this represents the end of the Rojava Revolution, which you've alluded to as well, and some say it represents a new phase of the same struggle. What are your sources telling you, particularly in terms of what is going to happen to figures like Mazlum Abdi? They're being offered positions in Damascus. Some are saying that they would not accept those positions. They would be forming new structures. What are your sources telling you about this?
Well, my understanding is that they've been offered positions that weren't really of any real substance, so they declined them. Some make the counter argument that, for example, let's say the position that now Sipan Hemo holds as one of the deputy defense ministers is one that would have allowed General Mazlum to at least have, you know, a seat in government in Damascus from where he could perhaps better argue his case and build networks and alliances that would be useful going forward, and that the smart thing to do would be to present yourself as a useful ally to someone like Shara, who still hasn't fully consolidated his power and who still feels obviously unsettled, if not threatened, by what's happening in Sweden in the south, where the Druze have their Israeli allies. So I don't know. We'll have to see. Is it the end of the Rojava Revolution? Or is it the beginning of a next? It is the next phase. Yes, it is absolutely the next phase and still being legislated. We'll have to see how far things go. But we just heard, it's not been officially confirmed, that the Women's Protection Units, the YPJ, will be integrated into the Ministry of Interior, which is what General Mazlum had predicted in March when I interviewed him. So, as things currently stand, we do see Damascus, on the one hand, making these gestures, stateless Kurds are now being given official documents. They have recognized the diplomas that were issued for this time by Rojava University and high schools in Rojava, allowing them to, compete in university exams and the like, or to transfer to other universities. These are all positive steps. But of course, language rights remain a key issue. And we do see resistance on the part of Damascus, though they seem to have been more forward-leaning for sure than Turkey's ever been. We've never seen Erdogan tweet in Kurmanji, nor have we seen a giant Kurdish flag anywhere that was the same size as the Turkish one. So symbols do matter, I think. But ultimately, of course, this is a process. This is an interim government, an interim parliament. Others, some would critique the SDF for not running in those elections. I kind of agree. I think they should have. However undemocratic they were, you'd still have a seat in that parliament in Damascus and be able to have your voice heard in ways that perhaps you can't now. But it's all a big question, but look, again, you have to look at the arc of history, at the broader context. All of these things are real progress. They really are. It's just not quite as we wanted things, but things never are they, really?
Mm. Well, when we talk about progress, one of the most important relationships for the KRG has been their relationship with the US. And you recently broke the story that the US has begun withdrawing its forces from the Kurdistan region of Iraq, removing the Patriot batteries from Erbil ahead of a full withdrawal by the end of September. That's what's said, particularly just as, and this has come at a time where Iranian and its proxies attacks intensify against the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Your reporting also noted that this leaves the region more exposed, and that there's real anxieties now among the KRG leadership and what happens once the Americans are gone. What are your sources telling you, and how significant is this withdrawal? And what are the KRG leadership worried about?
Well, it's hugely significant. I mean, first of all, the fact of being there was hugely comforting to the Iraqi Kurds, and they've been attacked almost daily by Iran or Iran-backed proxies in the same way that the presence of US troops in Syria, we should have mentioned that, their withdrawal, really altered the balance in Syria against the Kurds. We have to be realistic and understand that these, the lack of US support was absolutely instrumental, and that on both sides across Kurdistan, Kurdish leaders, Kurdish movements are having to make the best of a bad hand. That's the fact. Yes, it's a huge blow, and I think it's particularly worrisome for the Iranian Kurdish groups that are based there, because they were benefiting from that protection, because a lot of those missiles were being shot down. Drones were being shot down by the Patriots and by the US forces who were there. But this decision was first of all linked to the US commitment to pull out of Iraq by September 30th, as agreed with Baghdad, though there were always, question marks as to whether that would be enforced in Kurdistan or not. The hope was that it would not, and that there would still be a residual US presence in Iraqi Kurdistan. But this was accelerated. Why? Because they were just taking so many hits from the Iranians and their proxies. And at the same time, we're seeing these stories pop up every day in the establishment media in the United States of how they're running so low on their munitions, on Patriots, on all their equipment, which they're not able to replenish at the speed that they're being, destroyed. So America has a real problem.
Mm.
And so they had to, I guess, redeploy those patriots to areas which they considered to be of greater strategic significance at that time. But this, of course, means that the Iraqi Kurds are, now more compelled than ever before to have to, first of all, fix relations amongst themselves. Their biggest, I think, problem is that they have not even been able to form a government, you know, almost 2 years since they held their elections, even though they held them a month before the Iraqis did in October 2024. Still no government, still at each other's throats, and therefore unable to present a united front against Baghdad and to engage constructively and to their own advantage with Baghdad. It also means that they have to handle their relations with countries like Turkey and Iran much more carefully. And yeah, it's the end of an era,
Yeah.
actually. It's the
Yeah.
end of an era as it was an end of an era in Rojava. That's the way things are.
Mm. I mean, finally, I want to ask you a slightly more personal question, which is that you've reported on the region we've discussed today against many odds for years. And, like many journalists say within Turkey and other parts of the region, you have also paid a price for it. Erdogan has attacked you by name at rallies. You has, introduced various charges against you, has targeted you with online pro-government trolls. Within these circumstances and at a time where actual reporting and journalism is becoming more and more risky, actually, what drives you to keep doing this? And, how do you keep doing this kind of journalism under that kind of threat and in this environment?
Thank you for asking that question because, as I spoke to you, I felt great pain in my heart also when describing what happened. But I really, really want to emphasize that we need to look at the big picture. And if I've learned anything in all these years reporting on the Kurds is that they never give up. They never give up, and they will never give up. That is my conclusion from all these years of reporting. You won't make them go away. And I think language is such a critical part of this, really, and will continue to be in Turkey and in Syria and probably going forward in Iran. What makes me keep doing this, I can't go back to Turkey anymore. I haven't been back in 10 years as of July 24th because there's an arrest warrant, which is completely ridiculous, rests on rubbish, and I won't bore you with the details. But I feel, if I feel proud about my work, it's because I've been able to record history. And that's what I feel I did in Rojava, especially this past decade, by going there, by writing about the, horrors that were inflicted upon the local population, the fact that so many civilians were killed, that there were the huge displacement of population, huge punishment of the population by attacking critical infrastructure. It still pains me endlessly that my colleagues were killed in a drone strike, and you know who I'm talking about, and that their bodies have still not been repatriated, Cihan Bilgin and Nazım Dashtan. These stories need to be told. Maybe they're not as flashy as and exciting as, the geopolitical ones, and people seem to be far more interested in that stuff. Well, I feel that as a journalist, that's the work that I care most about. Whether people read it or not, it's recorded, it's history, and I've tried to be as, accurate, objective, and factual as I could be in my reporting. And that's what keeps me going.
Thank you so much for your time today, Amberin. Thank you for your thoughts and, your analysis.
Thank you, Elif, for having me.
Thank you. And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.